In this crash course, we will explore ChatGPT's Code Interpreter feature, and for that, we will take a look at how it works, how you can use it, and in which cases you might want to use it, and also which restrictions apply to this feature. And we will then explore some concrete examples and give you some tips and recommendations for the most common use cases where you might want to take advantage of the new magical ChatGPT's Code Interpreter.
Tectonic shift. Shaping the future with innovation.
Hello everyone, welcome to Tectonic Shift. Together, let's dive deep into the ChatGPT Code Interpreter and master it. So, what's the idea behind ChatGPT's Code Interpreter feature? Well, one very important use case for using ChatGPT is to use ChatGPT to generate code, because ChatGPT is capable of generating code for a vast variety of programming languages. But without Code Interpreter, you then have to take that generated code and execute it on your own, which often also means that you need to install or set up extra tools that might be required to execute that code. With Code Interpreter, ChatGPT is not just able to generate the code, but it's also able to execute that code. It's able to execute those generated code snippets in an isolated, restricted execution environment, and therefore certain restrictions to which I will come back will apply, and at this point of time it's also just Python code that can be executed. Nonetheless, this is of course an extremely useful feature that can be used for a broad variety of use cases. You could use this feature to perform mathematical calculations and you would no longer face the danger of running into hallucinations. Since with Code Interpreter, ChatGPT is now able to write the code that will then perform the mathematical calculation instead of trying to predict the result, which can sometimes be wrong. You could also use Code Interpreter to generate dummy data or extract information from files or transform file content. You can use it for data science to load and clean data, and of course to analyze data and build charts. And you can also use it for image editing. For example, to analyze and transform images or do other exciting things with images. And there might be more use cases where you want to use Code Interpreter. Because even though these here are probably the most important and common use cases, as with ChatGPT in general, it's of course ultimately your imagination that's the limit. Though, speaking of limits, Code Interpreter definitely has some limits, because the code that gets generated and executed by ChatGPT is executed in an isolated execution environment provided by OpenAI. So that code that's generated and executed is executed on machines owned and operated by OpenAI, and therefore certain restrictions set by OpenAI do apply. For example, at the moment, OpenAI only provides an execution environment for Python code. So you can't execute other code with Code Interpreter at this point of time. Although that, of course, may change over time. In addition, the code that is being executed in that environment does not have internet access. So if you are trying to run some code that would need to reach out to the internet, for example, to crawl or summarize a website, that code would fail and would not work. In addition, this environment of course also has no access to your local hard drive, because as I just mentioned, that code is running on some machine owned and operated by OpenAI. It's not running on your system and it therefore doesn't have access to your system. But if you are trying to run some code that needs to work with data that's stored on your machine, that code also would fail. Although ChatGPT actually does allow you to also upload and download files when using Code Interpreter. Though, of course, you should definitely take a look at OpenAI's privacy policy to understand how they might be using or storing the data you are sharing with them. For example, through file uploads, because you might not want to share super sensitive internal company data, for example. At least you should be aware of how OpenAI is going to use that data. Now, in addition, in that execution environment, there is only a selected list of extra code packages available. And with that, I mean extra packages that contain some extra code that could be used to execute your code. For example, there are packages that help with image manipulation or with graph generation, and while this environment that's provided by OpenAI comes with many pre-installed utility packages that might be needed to run the code you need to be run for a given task. There also might be certain tasks you might want to perform with help of Code Interpreter that just won't work because a certain package that might be needed might be missing. Though in our experience, Code Interpreter and ChatGPT are doing quite well when it comes to identifying such situations and are then often able to generate and execute some alternative code that does not require a certain package that might be missing. Last but not least, another important code interpreter restriction is that it's only available for ChatGPT Plus users and not available in the free version. So now we know what code interpreter is and how it works and which restrictions apply. Let's start using it and let's start diving into some important prompting techniques. But of course, first of all, you have to make sure that you can really use this feature. And when it comes to using that feature, at least at the point of time where I'm recording this video, by default, you won't find any ChatGPT version that would have Code Interpreter enabled by default. No matter if you're a Plus user or not, instead, at the moment, you have to go to your settings and then there under Beta features, you have to explicitly enable Code Interpreter. Now that of course may change in the future, but at the moment that's how you can enable it. Now once you did enable this feature, you will find a ChatGPT option with Code Interpreter when selecting the GPT-4 model. And once you enable that specific version of the model or that version that has the Code Interpreter unlocked to be precise, you're ready to use it. And now with that enabled, ChatGPT will try to use Code Interpreter if it helps ChatGPT solve a certain problems in a better way. Or if it allows ChatGPT to solve a problem it would not be able to solve otherwise. For example, with Code Interpreter enabled and selected, we could now ask ChatGPT to generate 10 random integer numbers, which are simply numbers without decimal places between 1 and 50. And now, instead of guessing or predicting such numbers as ChatGPT might normally do, it will indeed generate some Python code and execute that code and then give us the result of that code execution. Now, what's great about this code interpreter feature is that by default, all the work that's being performed is hidden from you so that if you don't have a programming background, you don't have to deal with details of what just happened. But if you want to take a closer look, you can do that by clicking here on show work, and once you do that, you will see the actual code that was generated and the result of executing that code. Though that result is then of course also output here in a prettier way by ChatGPT. What's also important to note is that when using Code Interpreter, a single chat session, so all the messages in a single chat share the same execution environment. Therefore, if I now send a follow-up message like multiply every number with 2, ChatGPT will again use Code Interpreter, but it will use Interpreter in that same execution environment. And therefore here, if we take a closer look at the work performed, you can actually see that it uses the same random numbers variable as it's called in programming that was generated in the previous response from ChatGPT. So instead of regenerating the entire code and losing results from previous calculations, it keeps those results. Now, for certain tasks, you might want ChatGPT to execute for you. You also might need to share data with ChatGPT. For example, here I have an AI text file locally on my system, which is simply a file that contains some text about artificial intelligence and how it evolved over the last years. Now, for some reason, this entire text is written in all lowercase characters, and I might want to use ChatGPT and Code Interpreter to probably capitalize this text. So that, for example, the first word of every sentence starts with a capital character. So therefore, here I need to share this file with ChatGPT. Now, of course, you did learn that ChatGPT does not have access to your hard drive though, but thankfully, you can upload files to ChatGPT when using Code Interpreter only because this option is not available in the other modes. But when using that, you have this plus button here which allows you to upload a file. And you can therefore then of course use this button to select and upload a file. And there is a limit regarding the maximum file size you can upload here. At that moment, it's 100 megabyte, and whenever you do upload a file, which you now also could delete and re-upload it if you accidentally uploaded a wrong file. But whenever you did upload a file, this file will automatically be taken into account by ChatGPT when it uses Code Interpreter. So this file is made available in that isolated execution environment provided by OpenAI. And therefore, here we could then, for example, tell ChatGPT to convert the text in the uploaded file to properly capitalize text. And when we do that, again, ChatGPT will use Code Interpreter to generate and then also execute some code that does indeed use this file to capitalize the text in there. In this case here, it actually generated a couple of separate pieces of code, and it did indeed try to use a library in that code that was generated that it is not supported in this environment. And as I mentioned before, fortunately a chat GPT is then often able to detect the problem and fall back to an alternative solution like it did here, where it then generated and executed some alternative code that also solves the problem. Now, that solution might not be as good as the first solution it's tried. For example, here when it comes to capitalizing the text, it's now using a simpler approach which might not handle all edge cases, but it will produce a result. And often that result will be absolutely fine, as it is here where I'm indeed getting my properly capitalized text. Now, as you can see here, ChatGPT also actually detects that because it had to use this simpler alternative approach, certain special words, to be precise, acronyms that might be stored in this text like AI were not capitalized. But it even asks me if it should enhance its solution to do that. And since we are sharing one single environment here across multiple messages, as you learned, I can simply give another instruction via new prompt in the same chat. Please also capitalize acronyms. And with that, ChatGPT will again produce some new code that takes the result from before into account, and that does aim to produce a better result. Here you see that it simply also now looks for AI, NLP, and scans text, and that it will then manually transform all these words to uppercase variants of those words in the final text. And with that, AI, for example, is properly capitalized. Now, ChatGPT is not just able to handle uploaded files, but it's also able to produce new files that can then also be downloaded by you. For example, here where I got this improved version of this text, we could now also ask ChatGPT to give us that text in a text file. For example, by sending this message here to ChatGPT. And here ChatGPT then again produces some code that will indeed generate a new file, and it will then expose a link to that file, which allows us to download that file so that I now got it locally on my system, and I can open and read that file locally on my system. So now that you know how Code Interpreter can generally be used, let's explore prompt engineering with Code Interpreter enabled. So we can create and send a prompt like this. We are giving ChatGPT a role and a goal and then some additional context. For example, the input data for this investment which I want to calculate with that message here. So the amount initially invested, for example, the expected annual rate of return, and additional amount invested that will be invested every year at the end of that year. The duration of this investment, so how long we want to hold it until we want to get our money back. And then I'm giving ChatGPT some additional context regarding the expected result it should produce. So some details about that result it should generate. And with that, with Code Interpreter enabled, if we send a prompt like this to ChatGPT, it will again try to solve this task, and all our extra details will help ChatGPT solve that task. But now, as you can see here, it starts by giving me a formula I could use to derive the value of my investment and all these intermediate results. But it then also goes ahead and produces some code and executes that code to give me the results for that investment. Please note that Code Interpreter is the beta feature and can have bugs. As you can see, it has failed at the end in my case, so let's regenerate the response. On regenerating the response, it will start producing the results with some alternative way so that it should give us the end results we want. So we have learned that sometimes ChatGPT also messed up the results and give error. Even sometimes it can give you the wrong answers. So finally, here we have the correct output, and it's also possible that even after setting this follow-up prompt and even more follow-up prompts, ChatGPT was not able to produce the correct results. I had both cases while preparing for this recording here because ChatGPT in general and of course all the code interpreter still is not perfect. After all, ChatGPT is still able to hallucinate and produce wrong results, and it's therefore, of course, also able to produce wrong code. So it absolutely can happen that ChatGPT produces code that does execute correctly, but that simply contains some logical bugs and errors that therefore lead to wrong results. And hence, even with Code Interpreter enabled, you of course should always be careful and double check the results ChatGPT is generating because they might contain errors. Now, when it comes to prompt engineering with Code Interpreter enabled, the good thing is, in my experience, that in most cases, ChatGPT is able to identify scenarios where producing and executing code leads to better results. Like here, where I'm asking ChatGPT to produce a color scheme based on a base color, and where it then does not just tell me how it plans to do that, but where it then actually also generates and executes some code that does that, so that I'm getting different hex codes that describe different colors, which hopefully when combined produce a nice color scheme. You can also fine tune your prompts by explicitly telling ChatGPT that it should generate and execute some code. For example, here we could say generate and execute some Python code that produces 4 color shades based on the base color with this hex code. Now, as you saw before, it even worked without adding this extra information, but it being more precise and explicitly telling ChatGPT that we want it to solve this task by generating and executing Python code. This should definitely force ChatGPT to use Code Interpreter if it's enabled. So of course, here it already gave me the correct result before as well, even without that extra information. But this can be a nice trick to make sure that you really get ChatGPT to use this extra feature and you avoid scenarios where ChatGPT maybe forgets to use this tool. Now, when doing prompt engineering for ChatGPT when using Code Interpreter, there's one very useful special technique that only applies when using this Code Interpreter feature you should be aware of. Let's say we have a file with some text that we want ChatGPT to summarize. For that, we can of course upload this text file and we could then tell ChatGPT to summarize the text in this file. Now the problem with this prompt is that ChatGPT might try to write some code that tries to summarize the text. But since ChatGPT itself is actually pretty decent at summarizing texts, we instead might prefer to get ChatGPT to just write and execute code for opening the text file. But we don't want ChatGPT to use Code Interpreter for summarizing the text. Instead, that should be done by ChatGPT itself. We could therefore enhance this prompt by adding some extra context to it. For example, here I am telling ChatGPT that it should summarize this text file, but that it should only write and execute Python code for opening the file only, and that it should produce a summary without writing or executing any code. That it should instead summarize the text on its own basically. And with that, we should ensure that indeed ChatGPT does not try to generate some code that tries to do the summary, but that instead it only uses and executes code for opening the file and getting access to its content, and that it then provides a summary of the content in that file on its own. Just as it would do it without Code Interpreter if we would just give it to some raw text that it should summarize. And this is therefore another pretty useful prompting technique you should be aware of, because sometimes you might want to raw ChatGPT behavior without it using Code Interpreter, at least not for all parts of the task. Now that we had an extensive look at how Code Interpreter works and how it can be used and how you should engineer your prompts when using ChatGPT with this feature enabled, I want to explore some specific utility task examples you can solve with ChatGPT with Code Interpreter enabled. And as the first example, Let's say we have an invoice PDF file which contains some typical invoice data, and we might want to extract the key information from that file like the address, the invoice number, the amount billed, and so on. While with Code Interpreter enabled, we can upload that file and then, for example, send a simple prompt to ChatGPT. Of course, we could also create a more elaborated prompt, and for example, we ask for specific details from the uploaded PDF file. And as you can see here, it has started extracting the PDF file content one by one. But using ChatGPT with Code Interpreter to analyze, for example, PDF files or images to extract information from them. But using ChatGPT with Code Interpreter to analyze, for example, PDF files or images to extract information from them can be a very common use case where ChatGPT can save you a lot of time. Another great use case for ChatGPT and Code Interpreter can be the generation of dummy data. Now, actually, ChatGPT is already good for that use case even without Code Interpreter, but it can get even more powerful with that extra feature enabled. And you could therefore send a prompt like this to ChatGPT with Code Interpreter enabled to get ChatGPT to generate some dummy data in this case. Some dummy sales data where you then also might specify some details about that data. So regarding how it should be generated and which details should be contained, you can also ask ChatGPT to get a downloadable file as you learned earlier in this course. So at the end, you can download the file and view the data it has generated by opening the file. So you can see that it has generated the dummy data as per instructions given to ChatGPT Code Interpreter. We have our dataset now. This means we can continue with the next use case of the Code Interpreter Data Analytics and Data Science. So this is all about analyzing and visualizing information. This is obviously not a data science course though, so chances are that you are not totally familiar with this topic. It all starts with the first step. Preparing data means loading data and cleaning raw data. Loading data in our case means that we upload the file we just created to ChatGPT. Cleaning raw data is all about identifying and correcting any issues, any inconsistencies in our dataset that reduce the quality of our upcoming data analysis. Examples would be removing blank rows and fields or changing data types for specific columns in our file. Once we have our prepared and clean data set, we move on to the data analysis where we apply descriptive statistics to our data. So simple calculations to apply in this step here would be the mean or the median. And once our analysis is done, we continue with the last step, data visualization, which just means creating different kinds of charts. As said, this is just a very simplified workflow. A real data analytics project is more complex. So general idea behind this example is to understand how it works and how the code interpreter can help you in such situations. As our file was created with the code interpreter and doesn't contain any kind of issues that should be prepared or cleaned, I manipulated this file a bit though. To be precise, I added blank fields to specific rows in our dataset. I deleted randomly specific data here in some rows. I added potentially invalid data types. So in here, I added the quotation marks around this number. So this might lead to a situation where this could be identified as a string instead of a number. We will see how the code interpreter handles this. We can now start with our little data analytics task. So let's get started with the data preparation. I open a new chat and once again make sure to activate the code interpreter. And let's first load our data to ChatGPT by using the upload button and selecting our sales data CSV file we created. Prompt engineering is important, so write your prompts correctly. Still, I want to use very short and precise prompt and see what the code interpreter makes out of this. So my first task is to prepare the data. And although we just used a very simple and short prompt, the analysis or the steps performed by ChatGPT or the code interpreter are quite impressive, to be honest. At the beginning, ChatGPT started to understand or analyze the general structure of our dataset. Then the first preparation step ChatGPT performs is checking for any missing values. It actually summarizes the results nicely down here in this list. We see that we have three missing values for product ID and so on. Then it will fix and remove the missing values. After that, it checks for the duplicate rows also. Later, it has also identified the string values and fixed that, which is nice actually. It also takes care of floats and integers. Last but not least, now it will implement all the changes it has identified. And at the end, we can download the clean CSV file as now we know that how to give prompt to ChatGPT Code Interpreter to download the file. That's all regarding the data files cleanup. Let's move on to data analysis and data visualization part. We can send prompts to ChatGPT Code Interpreter to see the row count, the mean for the specific columns, the standard deviation, and many other things. But instead, we could also calculate other numbers here in this analysis and visualization part. One thing we could be interested, for example, is how many products were sold on average on a specific weekday. Let's see if ChatGPT is able to identify the weekday based on the date and then calculate this average quantity sold for each weekday. For this, I could say provide a table with the average quantity sold on each weekday, and we get an average for each weekday. Obviously, this dataset was created in Python by us, so we can discuss whether this is realistic or not. Still, the important thing is that creating such tables and analyzing data quickly here with ChatGPT works quite nicely with the code interpreter. And the code interpreter can create many different chart types, many different visual types. For example, I could turn this into a bar chart. If I do that, I get a bar chart with this information. Now, also with correctly sorted weekdays, as we are still working in the same sandbox, we can also refer to any kind of information that we have in our dataset. So for example, I could create a line chart as well with the monthly sales, and this brings us some important information. We could also try to tell the code interpreter to come up with charts on its own. So for example, create important charts to better understand the dataset. Let's see what this brings us. And now we get 4 new charts, more or less new charts. We had some of these already with some additional information about what was displayed and also some insight and about the data that is displayed in here. We can even download these charts by giving a new prompt, of course, in the same chat and environment. And you will be amazed by the image quality it has generated. Let's now leave this area and let's move on with the next use case of the code interpreter. So let's move on from data analytics now to maybe a more exciting topic. Now it's all about image editing. This means we will see how we can use the code interpreter to analyze and transform images, to generate new images, and also to extract data from images. Data here means metadata, but also other things like text in an image. Really excited things? What we need though are images. So I'm starting with this people image generated from Midjourney with 2 people walking through the streets on a sunny day. I'm back in a new chat with the code interpreter activated. So let's upload this image and now we can play around with this image here. Let's, for example, get started with extracting metadata, so image specific information from this image. I will just keep things simple and just add this prompt. So let's see, and that's quite good already. We have got image metadata, isn't it amazing? Now we could dive a bit deeper into the aspect ratio. I could calculate this on my own, obviously, but I can also ask ChatGPT to do this for me. So what is the image aspect ratio? Now let's say that instead we want to have a 4 to 3 aspect ratio for this image. So let's instruct ChatGPT to do so. So we change the aspect ratio to 4 to 3. It should understand what I want right here. Now let's see what this looks like. Not too bad, but actually this looks like a little bit distorted in my opinion. I guess this didn't work perfectly. So we can say that it should not distort it, crop it instead. So basically we use it kind of like an image editing program, but we just instruct it to perform the required operations for us. Now it's no more distorted as you see. Isn't it amazing? So this is how we can analyze and transform images with the help of the code interpreter. Let's now see how we can actually edit our images in a bit more detail. Let's now add it and create images based on our people image. First, I want to dive deeper into the colors used in this image. To find out more about this, I could extract a color palette used in this image first. I asked ChatGPT for 5 color variants. These are RGB values, so we could transform this to hex codes if we want to. But actually this is not too helpful for me because I don't know what these RGB colors look like. Therefore, we can create a new image based on these colors, for example, with this prompt here. So create an image with the colors. If we check this, we get this nice looking color palette, so to say. We can also add the RGB code or the hex code below each square. Let's also do this. So add the hex code for each color below the square. So this looks like a little font issue. I will ask ChatGPT to make the font readable and it will then do the magic. So in this way, you can fine tune your images even if ChatGPT has generated a wrong result. Talking about colors, we can of course also change the colors used in the image, so we could make the image grayscale maybe, again by just giving it another prompt. And one final thing I want to show you now is how to change the file type of the image. So at the moment we have a PNG here, but you can also save the latest version of the image, for example as JPG instead. So save the image as JPEG will then give you the grayscale image as JPEG. Another really cool feature of the code interpreter when working with images is OCR, optical character recognition, or in simpler words, recognizing text within a digital image. So if an image contains any text, the code interpreter is able or should be able to identify this text and provide it as output in your chat. So let's now upload the menu JPEG, which is a dummy pizza menu, basically with some dummy text on it. Still, it has some formatting on it, some colors, so we will see how the code interpreter handles that. Now with this prompt here, we want to use OCR to analyze the image and to extract the text. The code interpreter Chat GPT should be aware of the OCR concept. And if we now compare what ChatGPT extracted from the menu and what the menu actually says, so what we see is it basically works. It doesn't work perfectly though, so you have to refine this a bit on your own. But still you have the text extracted from the menu, which is a great first step if you need this information. That's all from this Code Interpreter course. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for exciting new videos on different topics coming up next on Tectonic Shift. Until then, bye bye.